Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly O'Horo, and this is Adaptable, Behavior Explained. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today to Adaptable. I am Kelly O'Horo, your host. I am a trauma specialist, and we did this show so that we could help people understand why people behave the way that they do, especially when behaviors seem confusing. Today, we're going to talk about a trend called the no contact trend. We just had an episode on Oprah that was talking about it, and it's kind of everywhere in social media. There's a popular trending hashtag, no contact, primarily related to parents. And social media kind of frames it as empowerment, but what's really happening, we want to explore that a little bit more. And we want to talk about why are so many adult children cutting ties with their family, and what does this mean for families? I think it's a lot more nuanced than oftentimes is initially explored. We're going to unpack the reasons behind this choice, the pain that it causes not only for the adult child, but also for the family system and for the parents. We're going to talk about the difference between healthy boundaries and walls, which are so oftentimes inappropriately discussed. And if you're a parent that's feeling confused or heartbroken, or an adult child that wonders if this is your only option, then this episode is for you. So let's start with why this trend exists in the first place. Family estrangement is more visible and normalized than ever today. There are surveys that suggest 25 to 30% of Americans are estranged from one family member or more. Oftentimes, this is a parent. And there's, like I said before, there's social media hashtags like toxic family or no contact that are doing a good job of normalizing this conversation. And it's framing it as a mental health boundary, and it's talked about as healthy emotional boundary setting rather than rebellion. And so let's talk about the drivers of this trend. Today, we've been beneficially experiencing greater emphasis on emotional safety over obligation. And boundaries have become a really popular and hot topic and trend that we see in so many social media posts. And there's a huge cultural shift towards individualism. Your relationships are voluntary. Adults don't tell other adults what to do, and that includes family. And then when we've got all of this online validation, we've got support groups, we've got Facebook groups that you can join, and influencers that are giving language to these feelings, it becomes more socially acceptable, it becomes more tolerable to think about doing, and it's less daunting when you think about what might this look like if I choose to go no contact with a family member. This topic is really personal for me because I have several adult children, and I have one child who I believe has gone no contact with me and my husband, and it's just been very painful. And so I think that being able to share both sides of the coin is important because it's not without consequence. Let me give you an example here. We talk about like let's say you're 32 years old and you share on TikTok, I went no contact because every conversation I had with my family member ended in criticism. And I tried for years and years to explain my needs, to talk about what was going on for me, and nothing changed. And so in order for me to protect my peace, I made this decision. And so in that example, this person, believes and has discussed that they have brought this up. They have expressed their needs to their family, and they just haven't seen those expressions of needs to be fruitful. And so in that case, it sounds to me like they've made a conscientious effort and tried to do things in a healthy way prior to making that decision. And I really want to caution people that there are steps that really should be taken prior to making that decision. When we talk about the justification from like the adult child's perspective, we're going to look into that a little bit more deeply. Adult children rarely make this decision lightly. Most describe it as a last resort after years of trying to repair a relationship, to get their needs met, and to express the pain that they're experiencing. And sometimes in extreme cases, they're making this choice to protect themselves from harm. There's emotional abuse or manipulation or condescension or constant criticism that a child experiences. And no matter what they do, they can't get the behaviors to stop from one or both parents. And so thinking about like every phone call ending with, you're failing as a parent, I don't like the way you make choices with your children, and constant criticism, the child might feel like, I just can't keep absorbing that. I've got to have my chance to do things my way. I've got to be able to be the parent in this circumstance. And so that might be one reason to protect like emotional safety. Another time that a child might choose to do this is if there's like consistent boundary violations. Privacy is ignored, lifestyle choices are mocked. For example, I have a friend who will not allow her children to be posted in photos online, social media photos, and the grandparents or the parents were kind of continuously doing that against the wishes. And so the expression of this boundary is just completely violated or ignored, and it makes my friend feel like it doesn't matter what I want. The grandparent just ignores that and does what they want. And so that's an example of a boundary violation. And I think a lot of times as a grandparent and as a parent of adult children, I think about things like, I had my chance to do it the way I wanted to do it, and it's not for me to project onto my adult children how they should be parenting. And I think that a lot of times grandparents make that mistake. They've got their projected ideals, and they think that just because they're the parent, they can go ahead and tell their kids whatever it is they think. And we have to remember, as a parent of an adult child, if we haven't been invited, it's none of our business. And if we haven't been asked, how do we want to do something, we really don't have an audience. And that's an unfair thing to do to our children, but it's also an alienating behavior. And so it'll push our kids away. And so we have to be more open. We need to be more thoughtful about when and where we offer our feedback. And I actually have another episode on the change between the adult child and parent relationship and some tips and tricks on how to navigate that, because you're no longer in charge of things, and we need to not pretend that we are, because it will push our kids away. And I don't know a single parent of adult children that want that to be the outcome. And so that's just something to keep in mind. The other thing that often comes up is, and I've seen this in many of my clients, is the desire to break the generational cycles. So like saying, I'm going to protect my own children from their toxic dynamics that I've seen. I'll give you guys a personal example on this. My mom would get really erratic or irrational or irritable at times, and she would say things, she would pop off, and it wasn't often, but sometimes she would do it, and she would be really disrespectful to either her husband or to me. And as a child, I didn't have any control over the environment, and it was, erratic or intermittently chaotic. And I get to decide now with my children, I'm not going to be around that. And so I was able to say to my mom, hey, I know that you get upset and I know that things make you angry, but we're not going to hang out if you do that around my kids, because I'm not okay with it. Now, the thing that I did well was I expressed that to my mom. And then she had choices. She could take some accountability. She could work on it. And then I could say, I'm going to leave if you do that. It doesn't mean I'm not in relationship with you. It's just we're not going to continue to hang out if that's how you act. It's not cool. I don't want you to be like that around my kids, and I don't want my kids to view you that way. It's not in your best light. It's not in your best interest for them to have respect. So this is an example of like breaking a generational cycle that we can do. In my family system, it was like the matriarch decides and everyone just follows suit. And it was like my grandma was kind of a puppet master. And even if she would do nasty things or whatever, no one would say anything about it. And so I've decided in my family system, we're not going to do that. And as a result, I encourage my kids to speak up about things like that. And so that would be an example of breaking that generational cycle. Another reason that a child might choose to do this is basically to be in line with their own identity and authenticity. So if a parent demands conformity, for example, let's say there's a religious or cultural family system value that I want my kids to have, I don't want to put that on my kids because they might choose something else. Whether it's a religious choice or whether it's, who they love or how they love. And even if it's not in line with my values or my ideals as a parent, it's not for me to place that onto my kids. They have to have their own journey. They have to decide for themselves. And so that's about them having their own identity and authenticity. And we really need to love our kids where they are in their journey. Thinking about myself, I got to make my own mistakes. I got to make my own choices. I got to decide, what path I wanted to take in my life. And it's not fair for me to try to take that opportunity away from my kids. So you parents that are listening, this is something you want to think about. We want our kids to have their own identity, their own authenticity. We want them to become who they want to become and not who we program them to become. And it's tricky because we have all these ideas and we want to teach them, we don't want you to make the same mistakes I made, but mistakes are part of how we learn, and that's how we avoid failure, or not avoid failure. That's how failure becomes our best teacher. And as long as we're willing to learn, there's really no such thing as failure. So we don't want to rob our kids of the identity, opportunity, and the authenticity that they can then become and cultivate. And what it's going to do for us as parents is it's going to show our kids like, hey, I'm unconditionally lovable, even when I fall down, even when I make decisions that are not in line with what my parents want. And believe me, they know what you think. They know what you want. You don't have to say it over and over to them. They're aware of your propensities. And so they're making the choices they're going to make, but it needs to be separate and apart from what you want from them, and then love them unconditionally. Doesn't mean you try to drive their choices. It doesn't mean you try to I told you so them when they do things that you aren't in line with. We come in with compassion and we say, that sounds really hard. What does help look like? And I think when we can show up for our adult kids, then we are approachable and we don't alienate them. And that's one thing we can do as parents to help our adult kids get them. And for us to be in a symbiotic relationship where we are evolving into a friendship as opposed to the power dynamic or the power differential that exists when our kids are small. And so that might be another reason that an adult child goes no contact. Maybe there's just simply emotional exhaustion. They've had years and years of unmet needs and conditional love. And I say they've had death by 1,000 paper cuts, and it's just so exhausting, and they just can't take it anymore. And they might say something like, I realize that every interaction left me feeling depleted or drained or ashamed, and I just need some space from that. I need to give myself some room and some permission to heal. Now, again, I don't have a problem in the world with a boundary that's set and a child to go in their separate direction if that's how they feel. But we're going to talk about the way to do that in a healthy manner, and not just in a sort of what the kids say, in a ghosting way, because it leaves a lot of unanswered questions, and that's really painful. So let's talk a little bit about the underlying psychology around how this works and why. We've got adaptive coping. This whole show is called Adaptable for a reason. We behave in ways that are in line with how we survive our childhoods, our generational trauma, and we learn things to manage and navigate our environments. And so as an adaptation to alienate from our family systems, no contact is an extreme boundary. I would call it a wall, especially if there's no pathway to connection to restore or repair. But people would say they would call it an extreme boundary, and their intention would be to restore safety and reduce their overall stress. But I would encourage people who need to do this to really dig in and look at your own pain points, your own histories, your own attachment wounds, because typically those unresolved childhood traumas and lack of repair over time can make reconciliation feel impossible. And the truth of the matter is, the more of your own personal work that you do and the more attachment wounds that you're able to repair, the less permeable the projected behavior of your parent is. They are them, you are you are separate. And when you heal from those wounds, you can kind of accept them for who they are. And you don't have to take so personally the things that they do. And so that's really where your power comes in, is you can heal even if they don't change, which of course that's what we want, right? We want our parents to hear us and see us and our needs to be met, but we don't have to rely on that for our overall wellness. And that's the freedom. And that's really empowering and wonderful. So another area that this can be tied to for the reasons for the no contact boundary would just be, trying to ensure my own self-worth or my autonomy. And sometimes that estrangement reflects a shift from obligation to self-respect. So I've always done what my mom wants. I've always done what my dad expects. And I'm kind of over that. I need to take my space in the world, and I need to figure out who I want to be as a person, separate and apart from my parents' expectations. So I'm thinking about a client who says, like, I don't want to cut ties. I want them to hear me. And if that would be my first preference, like that they could hear me. But every time that she attempted to bring the pain points and her desires and needs to their attention, it would always end in like denial or blame from the parents or defensiveness. And so we worked together for her to choose her own mental health and how to set those boundaries healthy. But I really had a lot of respect for her because her intention wasn't to be overtly like harming to her parents. She's like, they're not bad people. They're just not hearing me, and it's just causing me too much pain. And so we worked through how to do that. And then we also worked on the exit that would allow for a return back for the parents should they choose to follow some of the asks that she requested of them, which leaves the pathway in, which really technically is what a boundary is. It's got a pathway to connection. It says, here's how I can be in relationship with you. Because that's what I want. But without the boundaries, then it's too messy or painful for me. And so as long as you can identify what you expect and what you want, then there's always a pathway back to connection. And that kind of leads me to the problems with the pop culture version of no contact, and where I get a little bit triggered when I see this popping up everywhere on social media. And that's because estrangement can be necessary for some people, especially in cases of like abuse. This growing trend of going no contact without prior attempts at repair raises a lot of concerns for me as a mental health professional, because I think it wraps around some social guidelines around it being totally okay. But I think a lot of the times it doesn't consider that there's other people on the other side of that equation. And so if there's like a lack of emotional clarity, for example, let's say someone says, I blocked my mom after a fight, and then months later, I still feel angry and confused. And I'm thinking about like the mom who doesn't understand what happened, because that pattern was always what happened is we always fought, and then we would talk and make up later. And then all of a sudden this one happens and my daughter won't call me back. And, she still feels angry. She still feels confused. I don't know that as the mom. And I think about all this unfinished business where someone circling back and saying, I want to talk to you about that fight. Before, my habit would have been to just sweep it under the rug. But what I want to do now is make sure that I stop doing that. And when you said, whatever it is that you said, I felt really hurt and angry, and I felt really shamed. And I want you to work on not talking to me like that. And at a minimum, if that happens, I'm going to disconnect, and I'm going to say, I'm going to talk to you later, and we're going to stop, and I'm going to set that boundary. And then you'll need to circle back and take some accountability for it. That's an example of how to do this in a more emotionally clear way. But a lot of times people don't know what they're feeling. And that's really where the roadblock happens. And so there's some work to do on the part of the person who's hurt. Is we have to be responsible for our emotional experience. We have to be responsible for knowing what we need. We have to be responsible for expressing what we're going through. And as a child, we shouldn't have had to do that. But as an adult, we do. As an adult, we are the only ones that can take accountability for our emotional experience in a situation, bring light and words to the situation, and then set an appropriate boundary for what it is that we need from the person we're in relationship with. And that's not on the person who hurt you. If you're hurt, you've got to say what that was that happened. People can't read your mind, and that can be frustrating. And as a child, it isn't appropriate. As a child, parents should just circle back and they should say, mommy was really angry. I shouldn't have said that. That wasn't your fault. And we should be doing that as parents of young children. But as an adult, we've got to set the expectations for what it is that we want, which brings me to my next point. A lot of times we're really missing skills that are required for assertive communication because we learned from our parents and they maybe didn't know how to teach us that. And as a result, we've got this content, this skill set that's lacking. And so if that's an area for you, a gap for you, I do have a show on communication and how to have more assertive communication. So check back in the full playlist for that. But a lot of times people just don't know how to set boundaries. They don't know how to do it without blowing up or avoiding and then bringing something like a stockpiling from months and months past, and then the person is like, wait, why didn't you tell me this so many months ago? I would have been so sorry. I would never want to hurt you, and I didn't even know this happened. And so that assertive communication is really part of what's needed on behalf of the person who feels hurt. And in this circumstance, we're talking about, the adult kids who go no contact. We've got some accountability to take with expressing what it is that we need. Now, I alluded a little bit earlier to the difference between boundaries and walls, and a lot of times people get this wrong, and it's a little bit of a pet peeve. So there's a whole episode on boundaries, and I actually teach a course on boundaries as well, because this is a really misunderstood topic, especially today. Walls have no entry point. They have no door in. There's no handle. It's just someone is on the outside. A boundary always has a pathway to connection. It gives expressed rules about here's how we can be in relationship. And I think that this is really important. So if you've stated or claimed that I'm setting a boundary with my parents because they just don't get it, in order to properly call it a boundary, you need to be able to reflect and say, yep, I said I won't be over at their house if they scream at my kid. And if they scream at my kid, I'm going to leave. And I will give it a 3-day break, or I will, only now see them the next time at my house, and I will ask them to leave if they scream at my kid again. So you've got to have some boundaries. Boundaries are like the pathway to connection, and we need to make sure that's very clear. And sometimes people think that no contact is the only way, but they'll find themselves reflecting, like, I wonder if I had set limits first, if that would have netted some change that what I would have liked to have seen. And again, if without trying, you just don't know. And so I encourage, we want to do those things first for sure. Here's another one that gets under my skin a little bit. The term unsafe. People using the term, I'm not safe. It's not safe. And I think there's a growing situation where people term discomfort as lack of safety. And discomfort is a norm in relationships. We're not going to have a relationship without tension or sometimes constructive or unconstructive tension. There is not a loving relationship that exists without conflict. And conflict is uncomfortable. It totally sucks. Nobody wants to be in conflict. Nobody thrives or desires to be in conflict because it's uncomfortable. But it's not inherently unsafe. And we don't grow when we're comfortable. We only grow in the discomfort. And so I caution you to make sure you're using the word correctly. Are you truly unsafe, or are you just really uncomfortable and feel without skills to address it? And I think that's an important piece to the puzzle that oftentimes is misused. So if you think about, for an example, if someone disagrees with my career choice, and maybe I use the word toxic. My parents disagree. They want me to do things their way. Is it toxic? Is it toxic, or is it just that they don't agree with it? Or if there's just a difference in opinion. And I think it's an important distinction to draw when you think about your reason for labeling something in a certain way. And then these decisions are not without long-term consequences. So let's say you decide to go no contact. There's no boundary set. There's no pathway to connection. And then, let's say years later or months later, you learn that your dad tries therapy after you cut ties. And if you had known that, you would have seen that there could be some changes that could be made in the relationship because, he now has an accountability partner. So you could bring something to him, and then you could say, I don't know how to help with this moment, but maybe you could talk with your therapist about how to better deal with me when it comes to this conversation, because I see that you're trying, and you only know what you know, and you only learned what you learned from your parents. And that's how the generational cycles of communication or lack thereof happen. And so it gives more room. And so again, these walls don't necessarily allow for the change that can be so beneficial. And now let's talk about the next collateral damage, which is the pain that parents go through. Parents often describe the estrangement, especially if it's ambiguous or they don't know what happened. It's like grieving someone who's alive. They're just absent. They're no longer in your life the way that you had hoped to have them. And like I said, this is a really personal topic for me. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about my son who won't speak to me. And he's asked, not to be contacted, but it feels inherently just wrong as a mom. I'm supposed to reach out. And so how do I navigate, he set a boundary, but there's no pathway in, so am I failing some test? I don't know. Every day I think I really want to reach out and just let him know I love him and I'm thinking about him and I'm still here. But I've said that so many times and it's met on deaf ears. There's no response. So it's a tricky thing. So as a parent, that's the other side of the coin. And I'd like to believe that I would be open to the conversations. It might not be something he would agree with, but I would like to believe that we could repair if given the opportunity. And the other thing as a parent is when a child couples or combines both parents. We're separate people, right? The mom and the dad, if they're still together, they're not the same person. And so you can actually choose to have relationships as the kid with different parents differently because they're separate people. And just because they might share some same opinions or they might remain united on certain things, it doesn't mean they would approach every scenario the same way. And so I think that's something that you can think about as the child as well, that there are, potentially opportunities and healthy alternatives to boundaries that are not walls, that are ways to allow for repair. Now, like I mentioned, those repairs require skills, it requires emotional clarity, but most importantly, it requires some courage. So learning to articulate your needs is a whole set of skills, and knowing what you're feeling is a whole set of skills. And then learning to assertively set boundaries without aggression is another set of skills. Learning to set boundaries without avoidance is another set of skills. And so you might need to get some help with this, a trusted friend, a therapist, because sometimes we have to help someone walk through how to do this properly, especially if you didn't learn from your own parents, which oftentimes we don't. And it's okay to show up with things like, I love you and I need some space from the criticism. So if you can respect that, then we could stay connected. And that's a different way to say something than just blocking someone because they've had a consistent pattern of behavior. You've got to have that clarity, again, like understanding what truly feels unsafe versus what feels uncomfortable, and recognize that, like, for example, let's talk, if we talk about politics, we don't need to talk about politics during our visits. That's a boundary. That's not a wall. That's not saying my parents are, unteachable. I can say, listen, I get that we have some different views and I respect that yours are not mine, but when we're together, let's not talk about it because we're not really in a place where we can meet eye to eye, and it just introduces, conflict. And of course, like I said, this topic takes a lot of courage. We have to face hard conversations instead of opting for that quick fix. We need to think about leaning into the discomfort and bringing things up that have been hard to face and talking about what we need or what we want and how we're going to navigate those changes in the future. And they need to be really clear, right? Clear is kind. And so making sure you've assessed all those things prior to having the discussion is going to serve you. So let me talk a little bit about some practical pathways between, no contact and total cutoff versus boundaries. You can start with shorter visits, limited topics. We're going to stay for 2 hours, but Mom, if the criticism starts, we're going to head out. I know I've had to do that on phone calls with my mom. I've had to say, listen, when you get nasty, we're going to call it. I'm going to tell you I love you, and then I'm going to say, let's catch up later. And that's what I do. And always, she calls me back in not very much time and usually crying and says she's sorry. But that behavior wouldn't have started to change if I hadn't spoken up about it, if I hadn't said, listen, it's not okay to talk to me like that. And I gave her the chance. I gave her a generous assumption that she wants to be in a relationship with me. And she doesn't want to be rude. She doesn't want to be mean to me. She doesn't want to hurt me. It's happening so quickly. She doesn't even necessarily know that it's happening. And so that's one way that we can, that we can bring those things up. You can write a written agreement. You could say, like, listen, I'll be in a relationship with you, but you don't get to criticize the way I parent. If that happens, we're going to end the visit. We're going to call it, and then mean it and follow through with that. Maybe you're having so much trouble with these conversations that you need to have something mediated. So maybe you need a family session with a therapist or a professional mediator to work with you, to help you to see both sides of the perspective so that you guys can come to a joint agreement on how to navigate the conflict that you're having. That can give you some, like a third party that can be not on anybody's side, but can be really specifically geared towards all perspectives being heard. Maybe we want to talk about the time that's limited. I'm going to take a break. I need a little bit of time. This happened with one of my other sons at one point. We had kind of like a big family blow up, and he said, listen, I just need some space to figure out how I feel and what I think and how to talk about it. And it was so great. I mean, it was hard, it was painful, but he circled back when he was ready, and he had done a really responsible job with it, and we were able to hear him. And so even though it was hard to be in disconnection, he had the courtesy and the courage to say what he needed, and said, I don't want to do it in a shitty way. I want to be kind. I want to be responsible. I want to be in my own values. And so I need some time to figure that out. So that's another thing that you can do. But you need skills for the repair often. And with those skills, for the parents, we want to practice listening without defensiveness. We want to not defend what it is that we said. If they say, I feel criticized, you just say, I'm sorry that you felt criticized. What would help you to feel more respected? Leave it clear and make sure you take ownership of the harm without excuses. And if there's a history of it, own and claim that you minimized feelings and that you regret that, because we don't inherently want our kids to be hurting. And for children, you need to make sure you know what you need, how you feel, and state those needs clearly. If you're really snarky and sarcastic, we're going to leave. I don't want to be around that. And so that's clear. And you want to make sure that you keep things measured and that the conversations are respectful. And then you can have an endpoint. You can say, listen, if we can keep these conversations respectful for 3 visits, we'll consider longer time together rather than just the short visits, because that makes me feel comfortable and boundaried around what I'm willing to tolerate. So I know there's a lot to digest in this show. I know that we barely scratched the surface of how this evolves, but the truth of it is no contact stems from pain, not necessarily spite. I know that pop culture can oversimplify as a really complex issue, and boundaries protect relationship, but walls end relationships. And repair is usually possible, but it takes a lot of clarity. How do you feel? What do you need? It takes skills to be assertive and speak your needs. And it also takes a lot of courage, because if you've had a history of being shut down or rejected or not heard or seen, then it's hard to kind of reach it back out and try again. So I hope that this episode resonated for you. If you know someone that's struggling with this, either on the child side or the parent side, please share this. It's such a painful experience for both sides of the equation, and I want this resource to be helpful. Please drop some comments if you have some different thoughts on it that I can address. And if anything was confusing, I'm happy to offer more clarification. But connect with me on social media. I see all of my DMs. I read them all. And so happy to be involved with that as well. So thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe and share. And until we meet again, don't forget to lead with love. It'll never steer you wrong.